Hi, I'm Elena, booktuber, bookstore owner, and classics lover, and welcome to the first episode of my Women's Prize Diaries. It is a few days before the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction is announced, but the long list for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction has already been announced, and I have already finished my first book. But before I give you my review of that first book, let's first see my reaction to the long list for non-fiction for the Women's Prize 2025. Alright, the long list of the Women's Prize is now known. Okay, I'm doing it like this because my phone keeps falling. Ooh, it looks like a really long list. I was very impressed with it last year. So
this is the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction Long Lists 2025.
Autocracy Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World, and Applebaum.
Didn't know that one.
Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age, Eleanor Barrow.
I want to read that one.
Eagle and the Heart, The Tragedy of Richard II and Henry IV, Helen Castor.
No interest in that.
Thousand Threads, Name the Cherry.
Need to look that up.
The Story of a Heart, Rachel Clark.
That sounds nice.
Raising Hair, Chloe Dalton.
Ooh, I love the cover of that one. I hope it's actually about hair.
Ootling, Jenny Fagan.
Again, I had some predictions, but none of them are on here so far.
Why Fish Don't Exist, A Story of Lost Love and the Hidden Order of Life, Lulu Miller.
Agent Zoe, the untold story of fearless World War II resistance fighter Elżbieta Zawadzka, Claire Mully.
By the Fire We Carry, the generations-long fight for justice on native land.
That sounds
Rebecca
interesting.
Nagle.
Wild Thing, A Life of Paul Gauguin, Sue Prideaux.
No, I haven't had success with art books.
What the Wild Sea Can Be, The Future of the World's Ocean, Helen Scales.
Too specific for me.
Peepshow, The Murders at 10 Rillington Place.
No, crime is also not my
Summerscale.
thing.
Sister-in-Law, Fighting for Justice in a System Designed by Men, Harriet.
Maybe.
Tracker, Alexis Wright.
Private Revolutions, Coming of Age in a New China, Yuan Yang.
That sounds interesting. Okay, none of the books I predicted. Alright, I'm gonna look up more about them and see which ones I want to read, but there stood a few out that I definitely feel interested in. So, I'm not particularly excited. There are not enough historical things for me that I personally really like. So we'll see. Okay, like the first one is The Story of the Heart. I don't like to read about medical issues for obvious reasons, but if you don't know me, I have a chronic illness, so like I don't really like to read about it, especially in non-fiction. Living with it is quite enough, even though like this is of course I think about heart disease, so it's very different, but it's like not for me. This one is The Peepshow, The Murders at 10 Rillington Place. I didn't really like it when I first read a little bit about it, but it's reminded me of The Five, which is a non-fiction I really enjoyed. Yeah, it sounded just very thrilling, and I did see it on Libro FM, so I'm gonna listen to that one. Sister-in-Law sounds really interesting, but not something I can read like very fast because I want to finish them before, gosh, June, when we get the winner. And this is Why Fish Don't Exist, A Story of Love, love, and the Hidden Order of Life. That sounded so weird, historical, and fun. I did buy this one. Let's see. Oh, and this one. Such great expectations for this one. Raising Hair. It's about someone who finds a baby hare and raises it, and it's like a memoir. This is the first one I'm going to read. This is Private Revolutions, Coming of Age in a New China, and it's a story of 4 women, and literally just coming of age. Oh, The Eagle of the Heart is about 2 like British royals. Just I couldn't care less, to be honest. So I'm skipping that one. And then Ootling by Jenny Fagan is about growing up in the system. And I have read fiction by Jenny Fagan. I think she writes fantasy. So this one I ordered as well. Ooh, very excited for this one. Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. If you've seen some of my videos, you know I love some historical nitpicky details, especially about just how ordinary people lived. So I'm very excited for this one. I also ordered it. I think it's a chunky boy. Second World War, I just read too much about it. I'm going to skip that one, even though I'm sure it's valuable. I just read too much about it. And I'm very excited about this book. This is What the Wild Sea Can Be, The Future of the World's Oceans. Just the ocean is something I find very interesting. Just recently, like in the last couple of years, I've really started to get a fascination for the ocean. Okay, this one is going to be a tough read, I think, but that's also one I'm going to read soon. By the Fire We Carry, The Generations-Long Fight for Justice on Native Land. Yeah, it's about American history. The story of the forced removal of Native Americans, which I didn't really read much more. It's just a book I feel like
I want to read. This one is so important to read right now, but I'm not going to because I just don't think I can handle it. But that is about dictators who run the world, not right now. And this is Tracker, which sounded kind of interesting, but not something I think I will end up liking. So I'm also skipping that one. And then Wild Thing, A Life of Paul Gauguin, which again, our books are just such a miss for me always. So I'm going to skip that one too. And this is a memoir about, I think, a very famous British person that I do not know. But I guess I'm going to get to know them because it's also on LibraFab, so I'm going to listen to the audiobook. It's called 1,000 Threads. The first book I finished for the Women's Prize long list of nonfiction 2025 is actually a book that didn't interest me a whole lot, but it's a mostly true crime book, so it's a very quick read. This is The Peepshow. Cover is right here. I listened to the audiobook for that one. I would highly recommend consuming it as an audiobook if you want to read this. This is about a man called Reg Christie who murdered women and put their bodies in his wall. Most of this happened in the 1950s as far as I have contained the information of this book. But that is not necessarily the interesting part of this book. I did not know a lot about this murder at all. So while the true crime part was new information to me and that was engaging and made me curious, I think the value of this book is in the fact that it reflects on how a murder like that is reported. It feels a little bit meta in that way because this is a journalist writing about true crime, writing about a journalist writing about true crime. So while we get information about these murders, we also get information about one specific journalist who wrote a lot of crime stories and also covered this story. His name is Harry something. I of course forgot his last name. He is quite an unlikable person in the way that he pursues journalism with a hunger that doesn't leave a lot of space for morals. This book reflects on the morals of journalism, especially when covering things like crime. It's about sensationalism. It's about the effect it had on the loved ones of the people who have been murdered or who were related to people who did the killing. I think the Christie case, I think as it is called, is also about a miscarriage of justice, although I wouldn't say that this book is really about that. We don't really get the answers to the possibility of that. Most of this book was about how a murder is reported, and it's for the Women's Prize, so of course you can expect that it's also from a bit of a feminist point of view, which I found interesting, but I do feel like this book wasn't incredibly necessary. I think a book that had been more generally about the way that crime is reported would have been more interesting than this specific case. At least to me as a reader, it was still very true crime heavy, which I, again, from a moral point of view, just don't really enjoy, even though this book did have a lot of attention for racism and misogyny within the way that journalism reports crime. So that was very interesting, but also did it give me any new information? I'm not quite sure. So the Women's Prize for Nonfiction's logo is: the Women's Prize for Nonfiction celebrates excellence, originality and accessibility in nonfiction written by women. I thought I would rate all of the books based on those three things. Excellence, I did think this book was well written. There weren't any points where I felt like the writing was getting in the way of the subject matter, which is one of the most important things, I think, if you write an informative nonfiction. But let's give that an 8. Originality, I'm gonna give it a 5. It was very basic true crime with a very famous case, even though not famous to me, it's like famous in the world. No, I don't think there was a lot of originality, but again, I did appreciate that the author looked at racism and misogyny within this case, which I don't assume a lot of authors have done before. So let's give that a 5, like not a 1. And accessibility, I want to give it again quite a high rating. It was very easy to read. You didn't need any prior knowledge of both the case or the British justice system. It was a very easy read. So again, let's give that an 8, which gives this book 21 out of 30 points for me. I just finished Private Revolutions and I definitely liked it more than The Peepshow, even though it's not without its fault. This is about 4 women living in current day China and in China for the last few decades. I found the backdrop of these stories really interesting, but I think that I did not find the people that the author interviewed very interesting because they had too many similarities with each other. I have a cat right here who really wants food. It's not time for dinner, Milian. Okay, we follow 4 women who have, I mean, a different way of growing up. They have different parents, but I think there are a few themes within their career, within the way their life goes, that is so similar that it was hard for me
easy to differentiate between them. They have a lot to do with volunteer work and education, which of course is interesting. I don't really see how the goal of this book worked best while writing about people who are so similar. There were two people, and I cannot even differentiate between them, who both did a lot in education. And I found it just very confusing because you alternate between the 4 people that are being interviewed for this book. I think I would have preferred this book if it was just 4 parts with 4 different people, so I could really understand their life better, because right now it felt a little bit random, and maybe that was the intention. By doing that, you may be able to view an ordinary life as ordinary as possible, but I don't really think it worked really well. Having said that, that is really my only comment of this book, because again, I found it really interesting to read in the decades that I've been alive, which have been exactly 3 in China. It's about the fall of communism and what effect that has on family relations. It's about the beginning of capitalism in China, which happens when most of these women are growing up, and it has a big effect of their parents. It's about children who are left behind, who were raised in small towns by their grandparents while their parents go to work in the city. It's about how education is and isn't accessible for migrant children or for children who grow up in cities. And I found all of that really, really fascinating, especially the part about communism and capitalism, which I don't find myself often being very interested in. Was very surprised that that was kind of the most interesting part for me. When these 4 women are getting in their 20s and their early 30s, some of them become mothers, some of them develop their own education and their own career. And at that point it felt political in a way that I did not necessarily enjoy, because there's some bias definitely by the author in that they praise the women for doing certain things. It's kind of clear that they have more admiration for one person than for another, which I noticed in how all of their interviews or stories, I want to say, ended. I feel like I'm being critical of a book that I did quite like, but I notice I do this more often when I really appreciated some parts of the book and I feel like they really stick with me and I've learned so much from it. And then there are parts that kind of diminish that experience, and that upsets me, which is ridiculous, I know. But somehow, because I did not think the structure of this book worked for me, I feel like I could have gotten so much more from this book. Having said that, let's give it a 1 out of 10 for all 3 elements. So accessibility, I would rate quite high, because this discusses topics that maybe a lot of people would not like to read about in a more informative non-fiction, because it could be very dense. This book is in no way dense, but because it's hard to distinguish the people that are being interviewed from one another because they have so many similarities, makes the accessibility a bit lower. But I'm gonna give it an 8 nonetheless, because I do think the writing is very accessible. Politics are very easy to understand, and you don't need any prior knowledge, I think, about maybe a little bit about communism, but just everyday knowledge will do to understand this book. Excellence, I'm gonna give that a 7, because I did think this book did a lot for me and it inspired me. It gave me so much knowledge, but because this book could have worked better for me, I'm going to give it a 7 and not something much higher. For originality, I'm going to give it an 8, because I think a lot of subjects in this book are usually only discussed in more dense subject matter, and I think it's quite original to look at the point of view, especially from women as well. Unfortunately, that is an original thing to do. What also made this original is that the pandemic is of course quite a big part of this book. We see our interviewees up until 2023. It's mostly how the pandemic affects their working and family life. It's not overly about the pandemic, like don't let that stop you from reading this. Yeah, I somehow find it maybe refreshing to see the pandemic as well reflected in a non-fiction. I saw this mentioned online as well, but it's great to see this kind of development story from a more recent perspective. So most of this is set in the 21st century. Really enjoyed reading about women from my generation in a different part of the world. Definitely valuable because of that to me. So I think that rounds up to about a 4-star. I will put it on the screen. And the next book that I'm going to read, or at least listen to, is What the Wild Sea Can Be. I have finished What the Wild Sea Can Be, and this is going to be a conflicting one for me, because I was both very fascinated by the subject and a little bit bored by the writing of this book. The beginning of this book was very info dumpy and I had such a hard time getting into it. I considered DNFing it at some point, but I am not really good at DNFing, so I did continue with it. I decided to alternate between reading the ebook and listening to the audiobook. This book contains so much very interesting information. Some or most of the information I kind of already knew, but nevertheless it did really make me think about it again and make me reflect on some prior knowledge that I maybe had on a surface level, but not backed up by the science that this author provides you in the book. It's about climate change and how on land animals can often escape the heat, but in the ocean that's not possible, only migration is possible. There are a few instances where humans try to do this and the outcomes were disastrous for the ecosystems in the place that the animals were migrated to. There's a wonderful chapter on Antarctica, which was one of my favorites, about the penguins who live there. The second half of the book really focuses on human involvement in the ocean, mostly through fishing, which I did dive into a few years ago, and it's very worrying. And I did enjoy reading about it again. Luckily, the author does give some help in how you can responsibly or not responsibly buy and eat fish. Feel is needed when you write a book that is so much about the harm that fishing does. I think it's very important to also provide the reader with what they can do. Otherwise, you're just aware of a problem without knowing how to act. And I find that very frustrating when I read about environmental issues. Like, yes, I know this is a problem, I can understand it, but what am I supposed to do about it? I feel with environmental issues, it's quite important that it is also a part of the discussion. Something I wasn't really aware of is plants in the ocean and the concept of force in the ocean. That is really, really dire. Something I really appreciated that this author did is she didn't try to simplify any of the issues. So sometimes authors do with these very complicated issues. They try to simplify it and therefore it becomes less credible. Because the ocean is such a complex and rich place, it needs so much more research and understanding, and it's difficult to research the ocean because it's incredibly inaccessible for humans, which is good as well. But if you want to know more about that, just read the book. But I really did enjoy that the author made everything as complicated as it is. In the last 2 chapters, the author also discussed what social standing, geography and gender has to do with the harm that we do to the ocean, which I found something very refreshing, because that again is something we can expect from the Women's Prize, but maybe not from other books written on the topic. Something that, of course, it makes a lot of sense, but someone needs to tell you for you to really realize it, is that the people who cause the harm to the ocean are not the people who need the ocean for their livelihood. And there are a lot of things that the European Union does that cause a lot of harm that I wasn't aware of, so it's very good for me to be aware of that. It's about how women approach sea life and aquaculture, I think it's called in the book mainly, or referred to in the book. How we can source food from the ocean without harming it is something that especially I think a group of women in Maine are doing, which I found really interesting. Where this book shines is in that last part, I think, where it's like changing perspectives, looking at things in a more unique way. The more general information, I feel like it's so well known, did not really find it very needed in this book. So when we look at the 3 terms of the nonfiction Women's Prize, excellence, I'm really going to rate personally, I'm going to give it a 10, because for me an excellent nonfiction means that I get very fascinated and interested on the topic, and that while reading this book I was constantly googling things, wanted to immerse myself in the imagery of the book, which to me only a really excellent book can do. So I'm gonna give that a 10, the first 10 for excellent. Originality, again, there were a lot of general topics like the whales and the penguins, which is very important. So well known that I'm not sure it needed to be in another book, especially because this book had other strong points. But because I did really like those different perspectives, I'm still gonna rate it high. I'm gonna give it an 8. Accessibility, I had some issues with this because the accessibility was only in the parts that are very well known. I didn't find the writing at all accessible. I found it dense, info dumpy. The only parts that were, I think, easy to read were the more activism part, the more personal parts from the author, which only really shine in the last half of the book. But I don't think that is really the kind of book the author wanted to write. So I'm gonna rate that a 6, unfortunately, because I really don't think this book is very accessible, which I think leaves me around a 4-star, maybe a little bit lower. So yeah, I'm really rating these books on how I feel they fit the Women's Prize, not necessarily whether I thought they were really, really good, because I will recommend this book to people that I know have an interest in the ocean. If you don't have an interest in the ocean or environmental issues, I don't think you'll enjoy this book at all. It really does require some attention and some push through, especially in the beginning. Those were the first 3 books that I read for the Women's Prize. I did share my reaction to the fiction long list in a set of reading sprints, so I will leave some highlights from that sprint in a clip after this. But for now, I want to thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in my second Women's Prize diaries. Doei! How I feel about them and which ones I've ordered. Spoiler, it's nearly all of them. So the Ministry of Time was actually already on my TBR, just more as a chill read, I guess. I think it is speculative. I think it's romance as well. I think it's very much genre fiction, which I really do like, that the Women's Prize doesn't just put literary fiction on there. Yes, it's sci-fi as well. I was surprised to see it on there. So clearly I ordered a copy, but I think it was a pre-order that I placed for the paperback. So that will take a little while to get here. But before the prize is announced, Somewhere Else by Jenny Deitch, I'm not really sure. I feel like this was one of those books that no one had heard about or anticipated. It is a Scottish novel. I always love a generational novel. Ooh, I did order this one. I think, yes, I got a physical copy of this one because it's just historical, bit of a more unknown publishing house, and I was sold. Is Nesting by Roisin O'Donnell, which I don't know, but it must be Irish, considering the name. And this is about domestic violence, and it's a debut novel. I wasn't sure about this because the Irish fiction on the Women's Prize in the last 2 or 3 years have really been hit or miss for me. So I decided that I would get the audiobook of this one. That one I didn't buy. Ooh, I did buy this one, Good Girl. And maybe I shouldn't have, because when I read more about it, I wasn't sure if it was for me, but I think it was a cover buy. And this reminded me a little bit about a book, Fire Rush, that was on the shortlist 2 years ago, which is also very much about music and about dance. Yeah, I mean, I do like the idea of the Berlin underground. Again, another one I wasn't sure about, but I did buy it. I think I also pre-ordered the paperback of this one. In a small seaside town, autumn is etching into winter. Gulls ride winds over the waves. Okay, I do love this. And 2 women pass each other on the promenade as yet unaware of each other's existence. I think this is a dual perspective, and I do like something weird like this. Like, she was a teen pop star in the 90s. So I think that's going to have an interesting perspective on feminism and like about the Me Too stories as well. Yeah, again, I can go both ways with a dual perspective, especially because very often then the women turn out to both be quite unlikable. So I'm nervous about this one, but still, somehow I did buy it. Okay, this surprised me because this one was on my TBR as well. But yeah, I bought this. Like, I didn't even need to think about it. It just sounded like a lovely break from the more tough subject matters. I think it has a hopeful and healing novel. Like, I think so. This will definitely be one of the first ones I read. This one I'm also going to audiobook, just because I had the audiobook for free and a subscription, so I thought might as well. All Fours by Miranda July. Again, let's not read too much about this. I think it's a good book to be surprised about. Okay, so Dreambound, I am not going to read. I was disappointed that this was on here. Like, I am not one for boycotting books or banning books, whatever. That's not me, but I feel like, especially now, trans individuals need our support and not our indifference by putting it on a list like this, or even more than indifference. I was really disappointed to see that on there, but if you want to read that, I'm not judging you or anything. I'm just not going to spend my money or time on that. Just pausing this video here to let you know that any revenue I make on the Women's Prize videos, I will spend on books written by trans authors. I will let you know in a future book haul which books I bought. Right, next one. The Dream Hotel by Leila Lelami. It had a lot of not for me vibes when I heard people talk about it. It's a speculative mystery, which like speculative, okay, mystery. So I'm going to also listen to the audiobook of this one. I didn't feel like this would be the kind of book that I would buy, would that be worth for me buying, but I know that the author is very beloved, so I do want to give it a go, but I am not going to buy it, I think. Okay, this cover. I'm saying how much I love the cover, but again, this was a free audiobook in a subscription for me, so I did decide not to buy it. But if I love it, I might, because look at it. Just look at all the vibes. I don't need an author name. I don't need a title. I don't need a genre. I'll read this book just because of the art on it. And not because it's pretty, but because it kind of reflects what you can expect, like historical and sassy, that's my favorite thing. Okay, The Safekeep, which is the only book I predicted in this list. It's a Dutch book, but it's written in English. The description doesn't necessarily sound very engaging to me. I think it said during or after the Second World War. A lot of people love this book, and then a few people absolutely hate it. So I'm really curious what it is in this book that makes people hate it. Yeah, I did buy this one, of course. Oh, we have more. Fundamentally, which I also bought. Again, kind of, I saw the cover. I thought like, oh, I'll like this. That sounds really, really interesting and very unique. I don't think I've read anything from that kind of perspective. Yeah, so I'm very excited about Fundamentally, which I also bought. I also bought Crooked Seeds by Karen Jennings. Yes, I bought a lot of books. So this is from a South African author, and I think it's a mystery. I think it is very plot-driven, which I do love with the more literary fictions as well. A Little Trickery, I'm also really interested in. The Artist, which, should I have bought it? Maybe not, but I did buy it. Because I don't like books about art. I like art, but literature about art just never works for me. But it's a historical fiction, and any historical fiction on the women's prize list, I just kind of want. This one, again, the cover, just, it's everything. I think it is set in Tudor England, but about the normal people, is how I have heard people describe it. And again, if it's a historical fiction on the women's prize list, I just love historical fiction. If I found this like in a BookTube video or somewhere, I pick it up if it wasn't on the list. Ooh, that could be a favorite of mine. Okay, this is the last one. Emma. Or Amma, I think. And it's also historical fiction, so of course didn't even think about it. I also bought this one. I think I just got a few, one book I'm not going to read and 3 books I decided to listen on audio because I wasn't sure about them. And the rest I all bought. So overall, I'm actually quite excited for the list as a whole.